of a roll call. Just
Yep.
keep track of the names of the people that participated.
Holly sent me the list and I'm doing it as you speak.
You check them off. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
You're all set.
Great. Our meeting has started. Thanks everyone for joining us on the second day of vegetation standards. We're going to actually run out of time talking about all the things we want to talk about. I think Adam and I can sit down and chat about seedings and stuff for hours and hours. So I want to hit on some of the topics today. I actually probably have too much material to cover, so I'm going to hit some of the highlights of some of the previous presentations we've gone through. And in this first hour, Adam and I are going to talk about developing seed mixtures and the tools you can use to develop those, and maybe some of the professional leeway you have in some of those seeding mixtures for our vegetation standards. We're going to demo the seed calculators for you briefly for a couple standards. And we'll go through the tech notes in some detail if we have time. I have a few slides to present at first on some basic material I think it's worth covering. And then about an hour or maybe a little less, the second part of the morning, Steve Burchins is here, state biologist. And because you probably have been designing or will be designing seed mixtures and plantings for wildlife habitat plantings, I'll let Steve cover 420 and some technical details about 420. And we've got these new things called IRs. So maybe Steve will spend some time explaining that on the last hour or so. So with that, I have a few slides. I actually have too many slides, so I might go through them kind of quickly because I have two presentations I want to touch on today. And I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and then Adam and I will probably just be live at the same time, I think. Okay, so we were talking about conservation cover yesterday, and we kind of ended, I think, kind of midway on my slides. I've combined two presentations here together. I'm going to go to slides. So Todd or Adam, are you seeing a buffalo standing in a field?
Yes, I am.
Kind of fun. So great. And I think it's kind of critical to think about, what we've done to the landscape with our plantings. This is the entrance to Badlands National Park in South Dakota. And it's interesting to see, their grazing herds of buffalo. Obviously it's a native species to North America. It probably evolved for the most part on warm season grasses, or maybe a mixture of warm and cool season grasses out in the western states, arid landscape. This summer probably more arid than normal. I think they've experienced some pretty bad drought. But this spring, that was in May, late May, and the cool seasons were going crazy, and the buffalo were fat on that forage planting. So that would have been, I think, a completely introduced cool season grass landscape at the grasslands region at Badlands National Park. So kind of fun. I don't think we do much buffalo grazing in Wisconsin, but I've seen a few herds. So conservation cover plantings and other wildlife type plantings I've been involved in. These are some of my own personal ones, and I wanted to show you a picture of what way too much ladino clover looks like. I didn't follow a standard on this. This is actually just a wildlife food plot, but you can take some of the information you have today and use it on different plantings if you like to. One thing I noticed about this is, this is the second year of a wildlife food plot that was old renovated CRP. And I just want to stress that when you put some of these small legumes in your seeding mixture and you start spinning them out as you're walking, I had about a pound of ladino and some Alsite clovers, and I had some cereal rye, and I started spinning it, and I noticed that I barely got down and back with a hand spinner across the field, and I was out of seed. And if you realize how small some of these little clover seeds are, and you open it up so you can see the seed come out, then it's probably 10 times too heavy. But this is my second year for this planting, and I can't believe after spring or the late summer mowing how much clover has come back, and it's just about a monoculture of just solid ladino clover. And I put a trail camera out, and you cannot believe the species of wildlife that are enjoying this plot. And when you walk through it, the pollinator habitat for this white clover, and is just phenomenal. It just buzzes with pollinator activity. So in a way, maybe I created a little niche for wildlife. Totally wouldn't meet any of the conservation standards we're talking about today, but it certainly was fun to do. So there are some super important factors for successful establishment, and Adam and I are talking about these things all the time. You know, seed to soil contact. If you sprinkle your seeds out on the ground for these plantings and you just walk away, you're gonna have failure. Unless you get a pounding rain that takes those seeds into the soil, the seed needs to be in contact with the soil, and I can't stress that enough. And I'll talk about a couple things that I think are just absolutely important. Maybe 3 different ways that you should focus on establishing your seedings. The dicots, these are the forbs and the legumes. Proper seeding depth is super critical. The issue there with clovers is they like to be super shallow. They like to be down about 1/8 to 1/4 inch. I just wouldn't plant them any more than that. Those little seedlings are not strong enough to push through, or if the soil happens to be crusting or something, those little legumes have to be at a proper depth to do really good, and it's usually quite shallow. I think Adam will attest to even frost seeding at the right time is super good enough for establishing legumes just because they get in that little soil crack and then they have a little opportunity to germinate.
Absolutely.
Yep, too deep. And too deep is another issue I've seen with seeding. Some of these drills, and I'll show a couple photos of a common Truax drill, is we sometimes don't calibrate. You know, you want to run the drill a little ways in the field. Now get out your pocket knife, scrape the soil, and figure out where the grass seed is dropping, and figure out if your legumes are just sprinkling out on the surface at a, or maybe at a really shallow depth. Again, too shallow. Don't just throw them out on the surface and leave them for Mother Nature to ruin. They will germinate probably, but they'll dry out and they will die. So successful establishments, that's what we're shooting for. And if you're a beginning planner, try to take some words of advice from experienced planners. Maybe if you're questioning a site, have an experienced planner come out and look at this for you. And they're probably going to give you some really good advice on site prep. So again, use high quality seed. And let's talk this morning, briefly about calculating proper rates using PLS and germination rates too. Proper timing, that's what we have in those charts in the tech notes. Tech notes 5 and 6 are there for you. Moisture and temperature are absolutely critical. So this gives all your seeds the best chance to germinate and to survive. Proper fertility, I'm not as worried about that for the grasses so much. They seem to find their way. But again, the pH sensitive legumes like alfalfa, and trying to shoot for a pH of around 6.3 to 6.8 for most of your forage plantings is, I think, absolutely critical for helping those. When the pH is adjusted, it helps the roots find the proper nutrients they need to get well established. So you've got some major options here, maybe just 3 or 4 different options. You can completely renovate a site, right? You could have the landowner spray the site, hopefully get some herbicide recommendations from an advisor, an agronomist usually, and you go ahead and terminate all living material when it's complete renovation. This happens occasionally, especially if you've got a lot of living vegetation that you just don't want to need or you don't want to fight. Maybe it's got a lot of perennial weeds on it. Maybe it's got a lot of biomass there. But you can definitely do that. Soil erosion will definitely be a concern, of course, and keep that in mind too. If it's a very steep site, maybe consider other options if you definitely think soil erosion would be a concern. Steep slopes, maybe highly erodible soils. I'm kind of an advocate for partial renovation on a lot of plantings because you can mow a site really good. That'll suppress a lot of the stuff that's growing. Maybe you've got a lot of undesirable forbs or even shrubs or invasive plants in there. You want to mow it first, maybe come back then with a herbicide recommendation, and then shallow tillage, or kind of what I consider like a scratching effect, just to get a little bit of soil worked up. So primary tillage, that's that heavy complete renovation. I don't know many plantings, maybe you do, Adam. Do we ever get out the heavy chisel plow? most of the time it's a disking, right? All you really want is to work up a small amount of soil and not complete and total residue burial. Secondary tillages would be very shallow, usually less than 3 inches. These have cultivators, harrows, a light disking. I don't even know if some of the new vertical till implements would do enough tillage to work up soil. They might if they're set a little more aggressively. I've had super good luck establishing into old soybean stubble. Seems like the ground's pretty smooth. Adam, you probably have some experience with forage plantings into soybean stubble.
2 years of Roundup Ready beans is the best thing to plant into.
Yeah, weed control, right? The weeds have been knocked back for a couple seasons. Maybe there's some residual nitrogen in the soil from that soybean. Got something to consider. And the stubble's really small. So sometimes I've done just a Great Plains no-till drill into soybean stubble, and it just seems like you can have some really great seedings with that. So keep in mind construction sites. If you're doing a 342, you might have to have the person get out a light disc and just gently work up the soil so you get some loose soil on top. Remember, construction sites have been driven over by skid steers, bulldozers, excavators, these types of things, and those soils can be really compacted. And you can't blame them. Some of those sites absolutely have to be compacted, right? If you're dealing with the downslope of a manure pit or some sloping and grading around a building, those need to be compacted so they don't slip away from the foundation sometimes. So one of my favorite drills in the world, Adam might have a more favorite one. I've operated these, used to borrow one from Pheasants Forever, and my neighbor has a good one too as well. But the drill, like a Truax drill or a Great Plains no-till drill, this is a smaller one. These are set up to do this type of work. If you go out there with just a conventional McCormick grain drill, maybe it has some discs in the front or something, you're not going to be successful in a no-till situation. No-till planters have a disc. They have a lot of weight to them, and their rows are quite a bit closer together. And then they have little press wheels behind the grass seed openers, where those black tubes in the front, that's where some of your bigger seeds, like your grass seeds or small grains, they fall down in. And you got these little press wheels that push it in. Remember, they create that optimum seed to soil contact. And in the back of these drills, you have for those very small seeds. Remember, I was talking about the accidents with too much ladino. There's a little seed hopper in the back with little openings that spin, and they drop that seed out at a rate. Also, these drills can be adjusted down to just super low seeding rates, and sometimes that's what you need. You only need a half pound of ladino. The drills have adjustments for that and some gearing and some levers that can be changed pretty easily. So I would totally advocate for no-till on a lot of sites. This is pretty aggressive disking. This is soybean stubble. If you were establishing conservation cover into this, maybe this was going to be a CRP, like a CP1 cool season planting, Timothy orchard brome. I don't think you would need to work a site up like this. Maybe Adam would have some discussion on that too. But this site's crumbled up pretty good. That's a double offset disc pulled behind the case there. I would have probably got the no-till drill out in a situation like this and avoided all the potential soil erosion from working up a site this much. That being said, if all you had was a drill or a spreader of some kind, this isn't the end of the world. Hopefully your conservation cover would get up and running. I might advocate for a nurse crop in this case to get down a half to a bushel of oats or some type of small grain to prevent soil erosion on this site. So again, partial renovation is very limited tillage. All you're trying to do is remove the existing vegetation. We do sometimes burn sites. I don't have a lot of experience to say on that, but I've done some no-till plantings for prairie restorations where they've been very successful following a burn to help remove shrubs and other things there. Burning would only be successful if you had quite a bit of biomass on the site to get rid of. So again, partial renovation, you still can use that no-till drill. Here's the back end of this drill. You can see a whole bunch more little mechanicals and wheels in the back. Definitely consider that. I think that's probably, you can use this on about 90% of your sites most of the time, especially with forage and biomass type plantings. And almost all your 327 plantings, you can be using no-till drills on those sites. I gotta talk about herbicides. There was some discussion yesterday in the chat. I think it could be an entire training on its own, herbicides, right? Most of the time we're talking about using herbicides that are non-selective, and they're just for site prep. You know, you want to go in potentially with these burn down mixtures just to control anything that's living. And then after that, if herbicides are needed, they can sometimes be selective. Certain herbicides will spray and you'll kill the grasses. Certain herbicides will spray and you'll kill the forbs or the legumes and preserve the grasses. So there's some opportunities there with selective versus non-selective. The difference is once you have your plantings established, that limits your options right there. There aren't many herbicides for, say, a conservation cover planting that has both desirable grasses and desirable legumes in it. I don't know of a herbicide on the planet that you can really put on there safely without killing or impacting one or the other. Again, we always have to follow the label rates, because if you go outside of label rates, you'll have some problems with that. And with all herbicides, the label is always the law, so you have to keep that in mind. This is probably one of the most favorite drills for grasses. Use these extensively on ground that is lightly tilled or lightly prepped. Native grasses require a special drill. This one may not be that drill. This is a Brillion. Brillions are kind of known for being a drop seeder, right, Adam? Kind of just gravity. The seed falls out in front of these heavy steel rollers, and it limits it to quarter to a half inch deep at the most. There
My
is some
favorite way to establish sites.
Is the Brillion?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they're just super good. If you've got a little soil exposed, this is a cheap drill to get. And you can see quite a few acres in a day if you have a bigger site with one of these. And these are heavy. These steel rollers, little cultipackers they're called, have little triangles in the teeth, and they help to push some of that soil in the ground at the right depth. So people have been using these for decades for most hay plantings, Timothy orchard, brome, and maybe some red clover, alfalfa. These work really, really good. Again, calibration of all the equipment is essential. I've done a lot of plots and I've spent hours just trying to get it calibrated properly, especially if it's a borrowed drill, right, Adam? If the neighbor used it for his hayfield and now you want to use it for a conservation planting, the openings and everything may be way off. And a lot of these are ground driven, so they're driven by the speed of the tire, and that's what impacts how fast the seed comes out of these things. So you have to keep some of that stuff in mind. Again, I think I talked about these. I'm going to move ahead. Critical area is one that we do need to discuss a little bit, because if you have concentrated flow channels and you have water running off or around your buildings off of your site, mulching can be required on those sites. And if the designer, the engineer needs it, and it's going to flow water, you're probably going to have to look at standard mulching, conservation standard 484 for mulching. Sometimes if it's a significant flow channel, you'll have grasses designed for that as well. There's a retardance factor, the ability of grass and its stiff upright stems to hold back water. And in some cases, you might need to anchor your mulch, either with, the temporary hay bale type things for slowing water down, or you might actually need to spread straw or a straw netting or some of those fiber-based materials to hold the concentrated flow channel in place. I've spent my share of my life anchoring some of these fabrics and mulches down on the site, these erosion control fabrics. Again, I think we touched on this yesterday a little bit, frost seeding. I prefer to keep frost seeding for legumes. Adam's actually done some kind of hybridized drill frost seeding that he could talk about, but kind of fun. But true frost seeding to me is just spreading it across the surface during that February-March period. So good. Frost seeding is acceptable for everything except critical area planting. Conservation cover, you could do that for all seedings. I would encourage you not to frost seed all your conservation cover seedings. And with regards to forage, I like to keep it for legumes only because they're more successful. We talked about some of this. Postseason management, always keep in mind that you need to walk that site after it's seeded and put that in your IR. We talk about some of these things, but your implementation requirement should have some guidance to the landowner for cutting height, right? A lot of people are going to grab a brush hog or a disc bine or whatever they've got, and they're going to cut stuff way too low. Introduced seedings should be, yeah, I think ideally that 5-6 inch height is perfect. Have them run it and measure that because it can be an illusion sometimes what 6 inches above ground looks like. I mowed some CRP this spring myself with a brush hog. We set it at about 7 inches and it mowed perfectly, but you get some areas where maybe the tractor sinks in a little bit and you lose and you end up mowing a little bit lower. There is a timing issue. Again, we're trying to fight annual weeds, right? Remember, in a lot of these plantings, we don't put down residual herbicides. There's nothing to prevent all those annuals from coming in. That's the lamb's quarter, ragweed, pigweed. Some of the thistles will want to start germinating in the summer. We want to catch a lot of those before they get to about that 18 inches to 2 foot in height. That's when the seed heads start to come out. So if we fail to control it at the right time, we're going to end up with a whole nother flush of seed the following either fall or spring. Again, steer away from burning. It's not a good choice for young stands. We can do burning as a practice once stands get established and at the right time of the year with, of course, a burn plan, right? Get out and evaluate your plantings. Look at these about a month after you've seeded. It's good follow-up, good relationship for you and the landowner you're working with. This is, hey, I just wanted to stop by. Even if they're not around, you can give them some feedback. Looks like your planting's doing good. But take a tape measure with you, take a square if you've got one. Look at plants per square foot. Introduce seedings. We want at 4 to 6 plants per square foot is acceptable germination. Think about what we talked about in the standard, introduce seedings. We want to see 60 to 70 seeds per square foot. And then we're just saying 4 to 6 is acceptable. But yeah, more plants will germinate over time. But if a month or so after you've got 5 or 6 plants germinating, that's probably pretty good. Native plantings, evaluate those in late summer. Wait another month from today before you go out and look at those, and you'll see we're looking for a plant per square foot of the natives. They take their time to get established. And again, it's successful. I've been relatively successful helping to raise this child to nearly 12 years old, but she loves walking through that conservation cover. So here's a field of brome grass. So successful establishment. I think I'm going to stop there because some of my slides will repeat and we're going to run out of time. And I have a little bit on PLS on another presentation I think is worth talking about. Adam, do you have anything to add at this time on establishments?
The only thing that I would add is be aware of soil type and texture when you're talking to producers with drills. You can really get quite a bit of different down pressure with the drills, and that can get those clover seeds quite a bit deeper if you're not aware of that. So just something to be aware of in your conversations.
All right, Adam, are you seeing developing seed mixtures?
Yep, we're good to go.
Great. So this one, I'm going to skip through a few of the early slides and get to, I think, was really good stuff, the meat and bones of the discussion that we need to cover today, because this presentation has way too many slides. We got about 30 minutes here. I want to leave Steve Burchins a pretty good amount of time today to talk. So this presentation is really, let's get into the meat and potatoes of developing your seed mixture. Um, Definitely keep in mind the objectives when you're thinking about your objectives. What's the resource concern number one? Have you got that written down for planning? Did you identify erosion control, or did you communicate with them and they want forages as their main resource concern? So talk to that, figure out the objectives, talk through all the logistics of it too. What's the long-term goal here? Is this just to be, Adam and I had this discussion yesterday. Do we want a conservation planting that could be good for wildlife, but then maybe the landowner wants to take some hay off of it, or maybe they don't? Talk about that stuff because that can make some differences on the species type and maybe that growth characteristics that we'll talk about a little bit too. Dig up some information about your soils. All the information for soil moisture regimes is available. There's information in the tech notes. Tech note 6 talks about introduced species, and it talks about soil moisture regimes and forage suitability groups. We abbreviate these. Now, the FSG, you'll see that in there 1 through 10, and we'll talk about that. Also keep in mind where you are in the landscape. Are you in the bottom of a valley? Is it shaded, only gets a couple hours of sunlight a day? Is it wetter than the surrounding hillside? Or in some cases I've worked on, we've got a complete dry south-facing slope. Consider species that are in a different that can tolerate the different soil moisture regimes. Maybe go to a dry mesic type moisture regime. Also look at the surrounding vegetation. Consider what is on the edge of the field. Some of this stuff can absolutely creep in and destroy your plantings. If you've got a huge infestation of multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, some of the real quick invasives for your new plantings will be wild parsnip. I've had some disasters with wild parsnip, and I'd have to continually mow that for a while to suppress it and keep it from going to seed. So I also talk about if the producer just wants a grass seeding or if you want grass mixtures with legumes or other plants. Other considerations to keep in mind is how much is this going to cost? Most of your cool season grasses and clovers, introduced species, are relatively inexpensive, but keep in mind that throwing in a pound or two of this extra, it's going to cost money. Clovers, I think I bought some recently, $3, $4, $5 a pound for pure clover seed. So, and then talk through all the equipment and how to get it seeded. Again, identify the purpose. I think I talked about this. Erosion, forage, is it for wildlife habitat, nesting covers, or do you need to switch gears and think about the varieties you choose for optimum pollinator habitat? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on grass biology. I think Adam and Steve and I could probably go on about this for days. We're planning to have some training in the future to talk about common grass and legume identification. Due to COVID right now, we're not going to get together as groups, but I think we're thinking about something for next spring or summer to get together some opportunities to do some grass ID. Just remember, grasses are monocots. They have one seedling leaf, and legumes and other forbs are dicots. When they come up, they have two seedling leaves. That's what makes them a dicot. And sedges are just different, and we could talk about sedges a lot. We talked about the differences between what's introduced and native. There is this thing you'll hear once in a while, the C3 versus the C4 grasses. C4s, just they thrive under hotter, drier conditions. These are called warm season. They actually need a lot more sunlight, and they tolerate dry soils, and that's why they've been around for thousands of years. Big Blue, Indian, and Switch, Little Blue, those are the standards. Cool seasons, they just grow better in that 40 to 75 degree temperature range. That's where Wisconsin sits a lot of the year anyway. Sometimes we don't even hit 90 in Wisconsin, 90 degrees very often. But then some summers we get we can have 30, 40 days of 90 degrees, and then these grasses will thrive. There is information in Tech Note 6 about the common grasses, whether they're bunch forming or sod forming. And I get into discussions about this. You know, sometimes we think that all grasses form sod, and technically, yes, but true sod is dense, it's thick, and it doesn't have spaces between the plants. When you look at a plant like this, it's spreading across the surface. This white root could be a stolon or other rhizomes. These pop up new plants right from the mother plant. This might have been the main mother plant, and it's growing and growing and growing, and it's sending up new plants. Now you're forming a sod. And some of them creep too. Once you get a few seeds established, if they find an opening, they can creep to the side. Some of them, like creeping red fescue, they're notorious for that. You seed a little creeping red fescue in your lawn, pretty soon you'll start to see a much larger patch. These are great for erosion control, and species like red fescue can even tolerate a little bit of shade. Bunch grass, I think probably the easiest bunch grass to identify on a farm is in the spring, it's orchard. Orchard grass, almost all varieties are clumpy. I've learned that there's some non-clumping varieties of orchard grass in some seed mixtures I've seen, but they even kind of have this bulb here. And if you see a 4 or 5-year-old orchard grass stand, the first thing you see is that huge clump, and it can get really big. I've seen some of these, the bases of these bunch grasses, to be 8, 10 inches across. And don't get me wrong, they are forage producers. These things can produce a lot of hay. And if they're not cut too low, there's a point on this plant about 3 or 4 inches up that if you cut any lower than that for a hay planting, you can really set it back. But this plant has huge root reserves and produces a ton of above ground biomass really quickly. These things, if you cut them, they can come back within 14 days. You can start to see a lot of growth on top of these bunch type grasses. So just standing in the grasses, what do you think? Is this cool season or warm season? Adam, what do you think that species is? I'm going to tease you for a minute.
Wheat.
It's I don't think it's wheat at all. I think it's wild rye.
I was gonna say probably wild rye. Actually,
Yeah, I think it's probably
yeah.
like Canada wild rye, Virginia. This is a cool season in Wisconsin. The wild rye species are, but we use them on I think native type plantings at some point too. So cool season or warm season. This one's a dead giveaway. You look at a guy reaching to the top of it, it's about 7 feet tall, right? Yeah, it's a no-brainer. This is definitely big blue stem. You can tell by the head of it. It's warm season. Big blue is really tall right about now. You can see some sunflower in it. It's probably 4 feet high. In some sites, this thing can approach 8 feet tall. It's really an amazing plant. And if you think about warm seasons, if they're 7 or 8 feet above ground, how deep is their roots? How deep is that root mass going down? It's probably going down 8 feet or more, if it can.
Bluegrass has got some great attributes for forage too, for grazing. Just as an FYI.
Oh, you're doing FYI.
Yeah.
Blue stem?
Big blue stem, yeah.
Big blue, yeah, yeah. Cool season, warm season. I don't know. I'm thinking. What are you thinking, Adam?
Wool and brome.
I think it's cool, and I think it's either red top.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the picture in the bottom. Yeah, that's red top.
I think it's red top because of this notorious small red seed, and it looks a lot like bluegrass when bluegrass is all seeded out. But the cool seasons generally, for the most part, biologically are much shorter than warm season for height. So we have soil moisture regimes to talk about for a little bit, and some common soils associated with wet soil moisture regimes. You're going to see this in your seed designs, and you're going to see the DM, dry mesic, wet mesic, and W. I think the only term in here that kind of maybe drives people crazy is the term mesic, right? Mesic to me is a kind of a bit more of a scientific term that means kind of wet, but can dry out at times, right? So let's talk about the wet soil moisture regimes, these are poorly drained soils. If you walk out there today and you need knee boots to walk through those areas, they might be vegetated, but the Adrian, the Muck, the Houghton, Colwood soils, I'm not familiar with Cebuwa soil in Wisconsin, but these are muck soils. They are highly organic. They have very poorly drained areas, and for the most part of the year, they can even have water at the soil surface. You can be sloshing through some water on these. During a drier summer, they can be dry enough to actually farm or even make hay on them sometimes. Wet mesic means they can dry out. Elburn, Orion, Moselle, Muscatina. I don't know if Adam, if you've seen any of these soils. I bet you Steve probably has. Wet mesic. Some times of the year, these can be poorly drained, but they're definitely a little bit drier than these true wetland soils. If you think about wetland soil too, you're probably going to see some of the hydrophytic vegetation. You may see cattails on the edge of it. You might see a lot of sedges and stuff that have taken over on these sites. Mesic, moderately well and well-drained soils are considered mesic. They hold, they have a good moisture holding capacity during most part of the year. I'm familiar with the Tama and the Velton and the Lafarge because it's from an area I grew up in Vernon County. The Lafarge soils, these have clay or silty clay soils, but they have a bedrock that allows them to drain out well. That's mesic. Dry mesic might just occur on a slope that's drier. It might be south-facing or western-facing, and maybe a little shallower topsoil like a leba. And true dry soils are those sands, coarsely drained, have very coarse particle size, Sparta sands, Plainfield sand, Boone sand. You're going to see a lot of that in the Wisconsin River valleys and in Juneau, Adams County, Marquette County, Portage County. You're going to see a lot of these soils that are Boone, Plainfield, and Sparta sands. The difference is when you talk about plant communities, certain plants can tolerate these moisture regimes and certain plants just don't do well at all. If you planted a dry tolerant species, or even prefers that, and you planted that wet, it would likely just die within the first year. It can't tolerate a high water table. It prefers to send down deep roots. And in between, there's some slop in between the three medium ranges, but a lot of it comes down to is just the site's available water capacity and the plant's preference for the amount of water it needs to grow. So we talk about this. This is broken down in Tech Note 6, and I might just want to jump out of this one and go right to Tech Note 6, and we can talk about this a little bit further. There are 10 groups for forage suitability class, 10 being the wet, and the first 3 would be the sandier soils. And there is a division in these a little bit. The 1 would have seasonal water table issues. And if you look, if you divide the 4 and the 6, there's the loams. Some of these have seasonal high water table, but they drain out occasionally. And some of them have no high water table at all. But there might be a slope concern there that's an issue. So they break these down quite a bit. I think forage suitability groups is probably the most important aspect of what you need to think about for forage plantings. Think about your maps, think about the landscape in your plantings. Some of these slopes, maybe it's along the edge of a ridge of trees, but it's a steeper side slope. Could be warmer, could be dry, could be some oliva or something along here that's underlain by sandy bedrock. See, we got this maybe township of Eastman down there. That's Crawford County. Cool, wet frost shade back in some of these valley pockets. These 2 bluffs on these sides will impact seed survivability and temperatures of those soils in those valleys. So think about that a little bit in your plantings. Design based upon the landscape. So a planting right here at this arrow is going to be different than a planting maybe on the side of a hill over here that's full sun and drier. So keep in mind, I talked about surrounding vegetation. Some of our new plantings, if they're close to a road ditch, you're probably going to be fighting wild parsnip. If they're very old areas that maybe were old CRP, old fallow lands, old maybe pastures that haven't been grazed in a while, you're going to be fighting some shrubs and other perennial, maybe woody species. Even sometimes it's hard just to keep the blackberries from coming in naturally. So keep in mind those things. We talked a little bit about monocultures versus mixtures. I don't think I want to talk about that too much until we get into maybe the seed calculators, but seed size and weight is something to be aware of. Here's that one we talked about earlier, is red top. A lot of seeds in an ounce. And if you can imagine how much a pound of red top seed is, it's a lot of seed. It's something like 1.8 million seeds. But compare it, this is a pop top cap, and compare it to the size of smooth brome. And that's why the drills we talked about are very important. Maybe red top is a seed you don't throw in that big hopper. Maybe you keep that one for your larger and fluffier seeds like smooth brome. Seeding rates, you'll want to keep an eye on the seeds per pound and keep that in mind, because a pound of bluegrass goes so far, but a pound of red top can go 2 or 3 times as far. So keep in mind, some of these aggressive species have maximum seeding rates as well. Black-eyed Susan, it's a beautiful plant. Everybody likes it in their conservation covers, but black-eyed Susan is aggressive. It has a really big leaf when it's starting. It competes others for sunlight, and it is a seed monster. Once you get black-eyed Susan in, it loves to go to seed. And other species like purple coneflower and bergamot tend to be pretty aggressive in your mixtures. Here's a little visual on seeds per square foot. Think of 12 inches by 12 inches, and a pollinator mix is about 40 seeds per square foot. This is what that looks like. And a basic prairie mix is only about 20, mid-20s per square foot. That's all the seed you're really putting down on some of these mixes. So keep that as a little visual.
Hey, Mike, can I interject on that? Oh,
Yeah, go
here,
ahead.
perfect. This is the perfect slide right here. This is all evenly spaced. What I was talking about yesterday, when you go to pasture plantings and you get way above the 60 into the 100 plus seeds per square foot, which is pretty common. Like, look at the right there. Imagine if you've got that with a 7-inch drill. Most of
Yeah.
that is going to be in 1, maybe 2 lines in a square foot. So the competition is extreme. So it's maybe worth cross-hatching or just really evaluating the goals of the producer.
Yes, you're saying, all the seed in a drill comes out in straight lines, right? Maybe the legumes can get sprinkled out a little bit because they tend not to go in the seed slot, but doing a crosshatch pattern on critical area plantings could be really important for super good coverage of that seed. So we'll talk about this some more. This is also available to you in the tech notes, and I'm down to about 15 minutes here, and I want to give, I think, maybe Adam a little time. We can walk through. I gotta get my my screen isn't responding. There we go. I've got some definite charts to talk about this. I've mentioned forage suitability groups. I've mentioned soil moisture regimes, and I'm not going to cover some of the traits in here, but I do want to hit for a few minutes on seed quality. And you should see pretty soon seed quality slide, right, Adam?
Yep.
Yep. And these spiral wheels here are drums with holes in them. And my first experience cleaning seed was organic soybeans. The soybeans had a lot of harvested weed seed in them, and it couldn't be sold unless we got the weed seed out. And there were huge drums that rolled the soybean seed through it. And all the small seed, like giant ragweed and lamb's quarter, fell out of the holes, and you're left. But this is how they actually clean seed, is through these tumbling devices, and the seed slowly goes through, and a lot of the weed seeds can be sorted out. So seed quality, and it comes down to what's on that tag. And we're going to talk about that tag here in a minute. There are some Wisconsin seed laws. I wouldn't bore myself with reading them, but there's some very important parts of it that they need to be aware of, and that there are some restricted and noxious weed seed species out there, and there's some tolerances to that. If it's found in some of these seeds, they either have to clean it out or they probably can't sell it. So it has to be declared on the label when you see this a lot of times. So there's a couple seed laws there. Here's some of the restricted and prohibited seed. Quite frankly, I wouldn't want to seed these either, but quackgrass is so common, it can come in on a lot of plantings. But wild radish, buckthorn, white cockle, dodder, giant ragweed, these are restricted from being allowed in seeds, in seed mixtures in Wisconsin. Prohibited means another word, absolutely can't have it, would be some of these harder to control weeds here. Kudzu, can you imagine, Adam, if we seeded a project and now we seeded some kudzu? If you've ever seen kudzu down south, it's absolutely devastating. This one climbs trees and overtakes the landscape. It's just absolutely incredible.
They say it's the plant that ate the Appalachians. Isn't that the word for it?
I've never heard that, but I've seen it and I believe it. It's unbelievable. So just a minute here. I want to introduce you to the seed tags. All this stuff has to be labeled on a common Wisconsin seed tag. It's going to be right at the top. It's going to be sewn into the top of the bag. I don't think I've ever seen it really like stuck to the side of a bag, but sometimes you'll see it on prepackaged plastic. It'll be part of the plastic label, but look for the seed tag. Also, while you're doing your projects and you're seeding, get a copy of those seed tags or take them from the bag. If the farmer can let you have them, you need to take a picture of them so you can go back to some of this information. So it'll label a lot of stuff. The name and address of the labeler. So this one here would be that La Crosse Forage and Turf Company. You will see a lot of seed from that company. They bag a lot of seed that's sold in Wisconsin. And a lot of this stuff is kind of like tracking. They can tell that there's a lot code or something in here, and there should be some dates on it as well and where it originated from. We'll talk about some of these other things like inert matter, and the weed seeds have to be declared. So this is the result of its testing. So there's a couple caveats here to be aware of with seed rules. They may be labeled with pure live seed instead of germination information. So that might be something you'd run into. Native seed, indigenous herbaceous species must be labeled with specific species names. That's important. And these will likely be either common name or they can be Latin name too, I've found from time to time. A tetrazolium test is where they soak the seed in a chemical, and if it absorbs it, it's kind of a germination test that they could do on seed. So untested seed mixes have to be approved by me or have to be approved by your ARC, someone with a little more authority above you if you have untested seeds. Coated seed has to usually specify how much coating and by weight. So you'll see that in clovers a lot of times that there's a lot less seed in the bag, but it can still be a 10-pound bag, but it'll have a percentage of weight by coating that's added to it. And so you'll see this from time to time, certified seed. Common one you see here is like you'll see this on certified seed oats. And then it might say Ogle oats, the variety, and then I'll have some information about the fields or the farm where it came from. That's certified seed. There's another category called source identified out there too. There is a organization down in Madison. It's called the Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association. You can take seed to them, and they can provide you with some information about seed too, if you ever need that type of testing. Ecotype, genotype. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but this pertains a lot to warm season grasses. Our prairie plantings will have local genotypes. Some of that's very important if you're looking at like a high quality prairie restoration. If you're in Grant County, sometimes you can seek out specifically like varieties of big blue stem, little blue stem they're kind of the local genotypes, and that might be important for high quality prairie restoration. And these are some regions showing that. We have some genotype areas in the state where certain types of grasses grow better here and certain types do a little bit better in the Wood, Portage, Adams area. Let's see, brand names and varieties. We could talk about that, but orchard grass is one of those things you'll see on seeding mixture bags. You know, it might be called Tikapoo orchard grass. Well, that's a variety of it. It's still orchard grass, right? The common names are orchard, smooth brome, and tall fescue. Bluegrass is one you're going to see a lot in your mixtures. You're going to see just literally tons of names for bluegrass. You're going to see horse names in there and ranch names and all kinds of stuff when it comes to a species like bluegrass. But keep in mind, it's still bluegrass. Here's an example of that. We got a fairly complex seed tag to look at. Again, this is La Crosse Forage turf. There you go. There's your distributor. This is the person distributing that seed. Information up here is the lot number. This is important. This is like blockchain tracking for this. They produce lots of seed all the time. They know where they gathered these specific varieties of these bluegrasses, and they blended them into a premium lawn mixture. And you're going to run into this from time to time. The landowner's going to hand you the tag and say, well, here's what they told me to plant. Well, maybe you needed bluegrass, but what we were really shooting for was, you know, Timothy, or maybe it was maybe it's a whole different blend that you handed them. And here's what they gave you: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different varieties of bluegrass on this tag. Each one has a different amount of pure seed that's involved, and each one has a little bit of a different germination rate. And also, look at here. This is where the seed was grown, Oregon State or Washington State. So you'll see that a lot on your tags. These are huge seed producing regions for the United States. And actually on a year like last year and this year, they've been going through a longer term drought. So you're going to see some of these seeds that might be missing from those states. So that's the common name, perennial ryegrass. This part here is the variety name. So Mystere Kentucky bluegrass, Palmer perennial ryegrass is in there, Diva Kentucky. Don't worry about the variety name so much. They all have different characteristics, different traits, maybe even a different color of green. You'll see some of these would be like a blue-green color. It's really cool. So just keep in mind, add them up, each one of the common name species if you're shooting for a bluegrass in your mix. I think Adam and I will talk about this a little bit more, what type of seed, germination testing. I think I touched on that. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to, I already talked about seed tag terminology, but let's go into calculating that pure live seed rate for just a minute. All right, so here's that tag again, right? This is the data you're going to focus on is pure seed and percent germination. So when something is 85% germination, all the seed is there, right? It's still really seed, but it's been tested. They took a bunch of this seed out of 100 plants, out of 100 seeds, 15 of them didn't germinate. So that you're going to see germination rates a lot of times in that 80 to 90% range, a lot. This is another one to focus on too. Other crop seed, I have no idea what could get mixed into there, but some things can. They have to declare it in the test. Inert matter. Adam, what could be inert matter in a seed bag?
Dust, chaff,
Yes.
any of the other stuff that might fall in.
Yep. Dead bugs. I've seen these. You can see parts of dead bugs or grasshoppers or something could be inert matter. This is just anything, can be sand even, could be in that bag. And weed seeds in there. This might be a little worrisome. We got 0.05% weed seeds. I might question what kind of weeds were actually measured in that. So this is one you'll need to do. And almost all the mixtures you're going to look at is you're going to look at that seed tag, pull up that PLS total germination, and you're going to take it times pure seed. So going back to this tag again, how do you figure this out for your mixture? Say you're given a 25-pound bag of seed. I like to dig out the cell phone because I got the calculator tool pretty handy. And I like to take germination times pure seed and come up with a number. So take 85%, 0.85 times pure seed here. So this is percent of the bag. So 98.79, but each one of these is different. So you're going to want to run the math for these things. I come up with 16.898. So just round it up to 16.9 for pure live seed of creeping red fescue. So that's a quick calculation you're going to have to do. Here are all the answers since we're going to run out of time this morning. Total PLS for all these species, when you add them all up, is 85.4% PLS. So if you told the landowner we need to seed 20 pounds to the acre of this, you have to do an adjustment for that PLS. You got about 15% more seed that you'll need to put down to meet PLS. Here's a good calculation on that. We add up the bluegrass that we need. We got 41.9% bluegrass. We need to seed 20 pounds divided by that 41%. So we actually need to be at 47.7 bulk pounds applied. So each one of these numbers, as they're reduced, is just going to increase the amount of seed that you need to put down. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it's very small numbers. Sometimes these things are 98% germination. You'll see that. But I've seen these pretty low. Some legumes sometimes can be pretty low germination rates. So that's about what I wanted to cover on that. Keep in mind, there are some different scientific names from time to time, but I'm not going to talk about specifics on that. They're not that important for this part of the training. I had a couple questions to ask in the end, but that's about it, I think. Adam, do you have anything to add on seedings calculations?
I would just add that if we go, are you going to go into the seed calculator?
Yeah, I think I was gonna go there next for just a minute or two, and then I want to give Steve some time. Okay. So let's talk about the tools you have available to you to work with. How do you calculate this out? And there's some programs out there that calculate it out for you, but you still need to kind of keep your head in the game here. We want to look at the seeding calculators, and these are available on, let me show you. I'll show you where you can find them really quickly. And on the web, you can go to Wisconsin NRCS page. Adam, are you seeing the Wisconsin NRCS page?
Yes, I am.
Good. Scroll to the bottom of that page where you're under conservation planning, I think. Yeah, I think I selected under conservation planning. And then I went to the bottom, and both seed calculators are located under conservation planning tools for CRP. Here's a seed calculator custom mix that you can use and a standard mix that you can use. These are Excel tools. We fix these from time to time if they get glitches or if there's versions of Excel that sometimes aren't compatible. We have to fix some things from time to time. Another place that you can see these, Adam, are you seeing the tech guide?
I am.
You are. Conservation Cover has one of these in the standard. Technically, it probably shouldn't be there because if we have to fix the seeding calculator, we have to fix the one on the website, and then we have to fix the one in Photog. But seeding calculator is also in here as well. So you can click on that, save it to your machine and use it. And then as you create calculations and you make reports, you'll want to save each one of those as well, maybe probably with a project name or a landowner name on it. So that's the two locations you're going to find the calculators. I'm going to stop sharing that and let's go right to one or two of these calculators here. Let's start out with just a basic seed calculator. Pretty easy to use if you've got some Excel experience. And I think I've got too many Excel calculators up. Going to take a few minutes to go through that. Hold on a second. It says I have a dialog box open, so I'm going to close some things. Okay. All right, so I think I've got the seeding calculator opening. I had to close it. It was giving me an error for a second. It had too many windows open. And I'm going to share that screen. Come on. There it is. All right. Hopefully, Adam, can you confirm you can see the seeding calculator?
I can see it. We're good to go.
Good. If you get the security warning at the top, do the enable content. The seeding calculator has some live links out to the standards themselves, and these are kind of hot links to the photog. And if you hover over them, they'll give you the address, and if you click on them, it'll take you right to them. There's some tech notes in there. I think tech note 8's a biology tech note, and there's some of the job sheets that have quick links to them as well. So let me know if this is too small to see. I'm going to zoom down just a little bit. The first thing you want to do in that calculator is just open it up. And if you want to save a calculator, rename it and save it. If you want to do that, I find I do that from time to time. But really the stuff up here, you want to type something in so you can get this thing started. So I'm going to just put in here Mike Stanek as my name. I prefer Columbia County, but there's a drop down here as well. You can, there we go. I prefer Columbia County because that's where I live. And just start over here, kind of work your way from left to right, and then we'll work down the page as we enter in our seed, our plants and grasses and legumes. I'm gonna pick just a conservation cover. And the program's calculating some things because you chose, see this standard seeding calculator is designed for these three standards. It's populated the species in for you then that are acceptable for 327. If you choose 342 or 512, other things will come in. Also, feel free to enter in a tract. Most importantly here, you need to enter in acres. If we have a 10-acre planting, go ahead and enter that in, put your initials in there, and the date, if I remember today's date. Don't put in the checked by and stuff yet. Now, there's that soil moisture regime, right, that we talk about, that dry mesic or wet mesic. Pick one. Pick the middle of the range. Definitely, if you're considering a wet site, pick that wet condition. And you want your seeds labeled in pounds per acre. We can get seeds per square foot later down the page. I'll show you where that's at. And then I'm going to do just a common introduced planting. So let the program chug. You see how it probably flashes back and forth. And one of my goals here is could be pollinator planting. I'm not going to put pollinator planting for just a basic run through of it this morning. And now you're kind of good to go. You've got some of the things checked up here that you need to have kind of pre-checked to get the program calculating. If you miss some of this stuff, it isn't really going to work for you. First thing you want to do, identify some of the grasses that you want for mesic and wet mesic. Because I chose that soil moisture regime, it's limiting this list to timothy, smooth brome, perennial rye, these types of things. If I choose wet, it might limit that list as well. Nope, it didn't, but it'll limit the legumes. I know that for a fact. So let's just click back on that mesic. Let's do the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. Let's do smooth brome at 2 pounds. Let's pick another grass here. It says it's given you the Latin name. It's giving you some information about that it is a sod forming grass. Let's do orchard grass in there. My favorite, it's a bunch grass. It tolerates dry mesic, and wet mesic sites. And let's do some orchard. Let's just do a pound of orchard. And then let's go ahead and throw in some Timothy. I like Timothy because it tolerates a pretty wide moisture regime, but it does well even on dry sites. And let's do 2 pounds of Timothy. So that's a healthy dose of grasses. You can, you get your seeds per square foot right there. See that? 2 pounds of smooth broma is about 6 seeds. We've got 56 seeds per square foot already. And that's not That's not really a lot of seed. But look down at the bottom, way down at the bottom of this page, and you're going to start to see some of these mix total tables. This is some important stuff you had to have documented for your conservation planning. So keep in mind, with introduced grasses, we're already at 77 seeds per square foot. That could just be a conservation planning in and of itself. If that's what the landowner wanted was grasses, it could be that way. I like to have a little more diverse planting, maybe if they want to make some hay off of it from time to time. So I'm going down the page further. I'm going to pick a legume. Pretty easy to just pick red clover. That's a fun one. Let's not go too crazy on it. Let's just go 2 pounds of red clover. That's another 12 seeds per square foot. That's probably plenty of red clover for most plantings. And it will have adjusted that seeds per square foot down here to now a grand total with the introduced legumes at 90 seeds per square foot. So that's where you're going to see that information. Remember, we have to be at PLS, so you may need some adjustments in what you're seeing on the label. So that's a basic seeding plan. There is a button right here in the middle of the top of this page that says click here to view your mix criteria. And it kind of just jumps you right down to the bottom of the spreadsheet. So because I designed a 327, I'm shooting for greater than 70 seeds per square foot. I hit that sweet spot of 77. I need greater than less than or equal to 1 legume. I've got it. I picked red clover, and seeds per square foot need to be, for wildlife habitat purpose, need to be greater than 30. I'm probably not quite there yet on that one. And then these are some information about seeding periods. The next tab you want to be actually working on for final is the seeding plan. So there's a tab at the bottom of the spreadsheet that's seeding plan. This is cool because it carries over the information you entered on the first page. That's kind of why I started you there. And we have smooth brome, orchard, and timothy with the red clover at the bottom. There's a monarch there if it's pollinator habitat or pollinator friendly. And then this is your seeding plan. You can go ahead and print this out. If you would like the landowner to seed a companion crop, you should enter that in there now. And be sure to select one. It's not showing up for some reason. Temporary cover crop, we're going to select oats. And I'm going to do only about 32 pounds worth of oats. 2 bushels is a lot, but I would enter that in. And it likes to put in 2 bushels. So conservation cover planting, we're not requiring fertilizer and lime, and actually red clover in the grasses probably won't need it. So fertilizer and lime not needed at this time. And you can go ahead and print this, and it will generate out a really nice page for you. So hopefully you're seeing that. Adam, are you seeing the custom mix seeding plan there?
I am. I would also put one little caveat onto that. When you go back to the percentage of the mix, I usually use like a print screen or the snipping tool. I'll just cut that. I'll print that out for the 6-part folder. That's very useful information for people down the road to have.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you may want to print this, save it with the name of the customer or the field name or something like that, and that's your seeding plan technically. So that's that. There's also another mix tool out there that can be used more for CRP plantings. I'm gonna just show you that one really quick, and I'm gonna give Steve some time to talk here. I've been doing way too much talking this morning. And go back out to that one. And let's see, I'm gonna navigate down to the, I think it's the custom mix calculator. Do you remember which one has the standard CRP mixes in? I know it's in Photog under CRP.
It should be right next to the custom mix. It just right along. They're both on the same page, or they were.
Okay,
So the standard mix.
standard mix. That's the one.
Then you got the different drop down menus advantages from.
Yep. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and open my standard mix file. Close a couple other windows. All right, here we go. I got it up there. Show you that one just for a minute. It acts a lot similarly to the custom, but here you go. Hopefully you're seeing this one right, Adam.
Good to go.
And you can add it in here, but there are some tabs at the bottom that can kind of make this easier for you, especially if you're designing mixes to meet program requirements for CRP. You'd want to enter in all this information here, of course, but then there's 5 tabs at the bottom here. These are 327 mixes that you can choose. So, we see a lot of these are real popular. The CRP mixes are in here on the tab. This is a common 327 mix in here, you'll see. Critical area plantings in there and common rates for those, the PLS rates. Remember, critical area is going to have super high seeds per square foot. Here's pasture, forage and biomass planting mixes that are in here. Forage suitability groups is pretty easy to see on the left. There's 5s, 2s, 8s. I'm seeing those. Adam wants to comment if he uses these or not. I'm not sure.
There's some pretty decent mixes in here. The biggest thing is just to be aware that not all of them are perfect for every situation. So don't be scared to step outside of these or design something custom for a producer.
Mm-hmm. And they're abbreviated in here too, right, Adam? We've got just starting looking at the one I'm highlighting here. We've got PP9, red clover, orchard, meadow fescue.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. So there's some abbreviated, and there's some CRP mixes in here too that I understand a lot of field officers are using. There's the CP31s. These are warm seasons. And here's some cool seasons up at the top. It was scrolled halfway down the page. And oh, there's a lot of mixes in there. Holy smokes. Here's common ones up here, these CP1 type mixes, alfalfa, smooth, brome, and Timothy. Here's one that I've seen seeded in the past, Timothy, orchard, red top, and ladino. So that's mixes on the standard mix. You can choose those, use those. Just be sure you're matching them up to the soil moisture regime. So with that, I think I've demoed and showed you the tools you have. I want to leave some time here for Steve. We've got probably about 45 minutes left in the morning. Steve, did I bore you? Are you still awake?
I am here.
Hey, you're teleworking today too. That's good.
Is my PowerPoint showing, Mike?
Yes. I had to hit the stop present button for myself here. Plus I had too many windows open. Okay, I'm seeing CPS 420 general criteria. And you're not in show mode if you want to do that too.
All right. Title slide there, I assume, Mike?
Yeah, you're perfect.
All right.
Good to go. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Birchens. I'm a state biologist with NRCS. I also serve as the CRP coordinator. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Conservation Practice Standard 420 wildlife habitat planting. This may be new for many of you that are non-NRCS. We've been using this standard for a little over a year in NRCS, so this is our first full planning year with it. And you may ask, why did NRCS need a new standard? Wasn't 327 conservation cover acting appropriately to plan wildlife cover. And I guess the rationale for that is that I think one thing you've probably had a take home that Mike has been presenting is that 327 is really an all-encompassing practice standard, and there's a lot of information in there. So the thought is that a lot of the wildlife information at times maybe gets lost in the shuffle of 327. So in creating 420, it just allows for a better focus just on wildlife. And obviously now that we are doing a lot of pollinator and monarch butterfly habitat work, it made good sense to break it off into its own. And this isn't uncommon for NRCS, and especially when we're looking at wildlife, because a good example is, we have 645, which is upland wildlife habitat, and that's kind of an all-encompassing practice. But we still have practices like 647, early successional habitat, which really get in a much more finite type wildlife habitat. So the feeling was that 420 just kind of gives us a little more focus on those habitat plantings. So I'm going to go through a little bit, since this is new for, I'm sure, most of our partners, kind of the difference between 420 and some of the other standards, what it is and is not, and then we'll talk a little bit about pollinator monarch plantings. So essentially the definition for 420, establishing wildlife habitat by planting herbaceous vegetation or shrubs. So pretty specific. And I will state, when the or shrubs addition to that is, we're not necessarily looking at combining a shrub planting with a prairie planting. This is more getting at, there are prairie forbs that we often take for granted as just being vegetative that are actually woody plants. For example, New Jersey tea, lead plant are technically both shrubs. They're fire dependent shrubs. So think of it as more of that type of inclusion with the shrubs. And I would certainly advise, if you are going to do a shrub planting in combination with 420, I would use 420 for the vegetative and use 612 tree and shrub planting as the standard to address the woody component. So the purposes: improve degraded wildlife habitat for the targeted wildlife species or guild, and establish wildlife habitat that resembles the historic, desired, and referenced plant communities. So the second item here is more of where we would possibly be using our ecological site descriptions. Also kind of lumps in if we had a remnant prairie and we're looking at managing that. So that's kind of a little bit more of an explanation of where that number 2 fits in. So where does the practice apply? So like I said, in trying to kind of lay the groundwork when 327 applies, when 420 applies, this practice applies to all lands where inadequate wildlife habitat is identified as a primary resource concern. So I think I highlighted that, and that's kind of a key. If the producer comes and says, "Yep, my objective is wildlife," versus if the producer says, "Well, my objective is erosion control, but I wouldn't mind having some additional benefits for wildlife." But part of that also, when we're looking at 420, we need to have an inventory or wildlife habitat evaluation that indicates the benefit of altering current vegetation, species richness, structure, or pattern by establishing plants or shrubs. So essentially, we're looking at doing that type of evaluation. In the NRCS world, that's our habitat suitability indexes, and I'll discuss that a little bit more. So essentially, of all the NRCS resource concerns, the only one that applies, and there's only 2 wildlife resource concerns and one is aquatic, and one is terrestrial wildlife habitat. So in this case, this only applies to the terrestrial. So sometimes more telling is when it does not apply. So some of these keys might help you. So the big one, introduced species. So we're never going to plan introduced species through 420. So that's always going to be 327. So that's a big distinction. So, you know, our pollinator plantings that are native, our monarch plantings are all going to be 420. If we want to do a honeybee planting and use clovers, white clover, all-site clover, that's going to be 327. I talked about the planting of trees, which is 612. If it's a riparian planting, we're going to use 391 forest riparian buffer. Oak savannas technically would be planned through our 643 rare and declining practice standard. And I will say that I'll be working with our forester, Alan Brown, and we're going to be developing some new guidance documents for oak savannas. So look for those coming soon. And then aquatic plantings are covered through 644, which is wetland wildlife habitat. And right now, neither CSP nor CRP actually include 420 as an eligible practice. So changes are going to be coming. You know, it's going to take the next CRP manual to change to add 420. And I think we're going to already see in this coming year changes to CSP that will include some of the 420 plantings. So I think that's why for NRCS folks, where we see, you know, some of the same information in a guidance document in 327 and 420, that's simply because we need to cover our bases for CSP. But in the future, you know, it certainly is looking that, you know, 420 will once we get those CRP and CSP kind of hammered out, it's going to be a lot more finite when we're using the 420. So some of the general criteria, and identify the target wildlife species or guild and implement all vegetative establishment measures needed to meet the minimum NRCS planning criteria, 50% of the potential for the wildlife habitat. So in with an HSI or Habitat Suitability Index, that's a score of 0.5 or greater where we're trying to get. And I will say those HSIs are on the Field Office Tech Guide. They're under Section 3 planning tools. And then you'll see those HSIs are there. And that's just our tool for determining a resource concern. So some of the applicable Habitat Suitability Indexes that we would use under 420 could be monarch, pollinator, honeybee. We also have a grassland HSI. So those are some that we would utilize. So now getting into the general criteria, use only species that are non-invasive and adapted to the site. And that's, I guess, goes without saying. And Mike kind of covered that earlier. Use native plant materials. Again, the distinction, native, 420 is native only. Calculate seeding rates based on pure live seed. Luckily, Mike covered that, so we're all up to speed there. If seeds are harvested locally from native sites, test seed for purity and germination in order to determine the pure live seed. And so this is all covered in the Tech Note 5. So there's a process that we have if a landowner does want to use collected seed, but they will need to do testing. So we don't necessarily promote that option, because oftentimes it's hard for a landowner when they're collecting seed to know they may know the common name, but oftentimes what I've seen collected, they have a hard time breaking it down to scientific names. So it can be done. It just takes a little more work. And like I said, that's all identified in Tech Note 5. Another part of the general criteria, implement all necessary vegetative establishment protocols such as site prep, weed and pest control, planting rates, planting dates, methods. So the reason I kind of spelled this out, because I'm going to touch briefly on implementation requirements, which are new to NRCS this year. And essentially, if a lot of you are familiar with job sheets, many of those are getting converted to implementation requirements. And I'll cover them in a bit, but essentially this old bullet is covered through the implementation requirement. Additional criteria on native grasslands, utilize other standards such as prescribed grazing or prescribed burning, may provide some of the habitat functions and values necessary for the target species with less disturbance. I think this particularly comes into play when we're working on prairie remnants. We want to be really careful when working on remnants that we're not, introducing species that might be aggressive and dominate those. So oftentimes in remnants, our first order of business is what can we do for management? So prescribed burning at times might be the first practice you would implement. Oftentimes burning a remnant or even previously planted sites, you could be surprised what shows up after a prescribed burn. Use only species that are non-invasive and adapted to the site. There are some native species that are very aggressive that we have to be careful about. I think the best example possibly is yarrow, where yarrow seems to be fine on dry sites, but yarrow on a mesic site can get extremely aggressive and almost become a weed. So just some things to keep in mind. So one thing that in the additional criteria, and obviously now that we're doing a lot of planning for monarch butterfly, pollinators, honeybees, that is captured within the 420 additional criteria, is plantings immediately adjacent to lands treated with pesticides provide risk to invertebrates. Use NRCS technical notes and other resources to implement techniques to mitigate for pesticide risk. So I think this kind of goes without saying, is that we're kind of defeating the purpose of putting a pollinator planting in if we know it's going to get pesticide drift and we're going to kill the pollinators that we tried to attract. So an exceptional National Agronomy Tech Note is Tech Note 9. And this is kind of a step-by-step measure that you can utilize in working with a landowner to mitigate some of these pesticide impacts. And like I said, it's I really like this tool because the landowner can decide which measures they want to adopt rather than us just stating what they will do. So it's based on a point system, and essentially you're trying to plan to a minimum of 20 points. And 1 point is usually considered 1% reduction. And there are 8 exposure pathways that are addressed within it, and you can pick the particular pathway that applies. And then there's risk mitigation tables for offsites. And like I said, there is a variety of mitigation options. This shows just one of the tables when you're looking at practices. So the first one that's shown here is that drift reducing agents, and this is becoming more and more common in agriculture. All of the co-ops are using drift reducing agents, and most of the larger farmers are also using these just because it's a really cheap way of providing a little extra insurance because there certainly could be lawsuits, and like I said, it's pretty much becoming the industry standard now. So this is 5 points. So like I said, you're trying to accomplish 20 points. So you're going to get 5 for just using that drift reducing agent. So that's pretty easy. And then you're going to get 10 points if you just utilize spray nozzles that reduce drift. And in the comments, it says higher volume spray nozzles run at lower pressures, produce larger droplets and narrow droplet size distribution, which reduces drifts. So, and so there's a bunch of other items here. I think the take home is if someone was doing drift reducing agents, they did the spray nozzles, and if they had a 30-foot buffer, you would hit 20 points. You would actually exceed 20 points. So, so this is just a good tool. And like I said, it's just good planning to take a look at some of these things to ensure, you know, we are not being impacted by drift. So, just to give you a little take home here of which conservation practice should I choose when I'm looking at different types of wildlife or different types of resource concerns. So Mike talked about 327. So primarily when we're looking at resource concerns addressed with 327, soil erosion, degraded plant condition, introduced species when we're looking at wildlife. How do we apply that 327? It's essentially vegetative planting is not specific to wildlife, or it's a secondary wildlife resource concern. So like I mentioned earlier, it's one of that kind of in a passing. My resource concern is erosion, but I wouldn't mind doing something for wildlife. So we can utilize 327 there. So 420, we've got that primary resource concern. Either it's a specific species is addressed, or we're trying to obtain a certain cover for wildlife. And we're always going to default to this 420 for monarch and pollinator plantings when they're native. So I guess that can kind of be the poster child for this standard. And then how do we apply it? We apply it by utilizing a habitat suitability index or wildlife evaluation guide to determine that a resource concern is present. And then just kind of added, I talked earlier about the 645 standard, the upland wildlife habitat. And for 645, the only really time we're using 645 is for honeybee forage. And so right now, Wisconsin NRCS, I think this year we had 1.1 million to focus on honeybee habitat. However, that could also include pollinator and monarch planting. So, but specifically when we're looking at this seasonal forage for honeybee, not a planting that is permanent and native, but looking at introduced species for a seasonal basis. So again, your clovers, it doesn't have to just be annuals, but it can be beerseem, crimson clover, can also be white clover and others, but including that with things like Lacey Facilia, flax, other species that are annuals. And so that is a practice that we're utilizing through EQIP right now. And so those fall under 645 because
Steve,
yes, sir.
Quick question. Are honeybees wildlife or livestock?
So good question, because originally when we started out with this honeybee initiative, headquarters did say honeybee is considered livestock. And but as things change and as standards change, now we're just, although I believe they're still considered or classified by headquarters as livestock, we are just lumping them for the sake of planning. When we're fitting them into our mold, we are, so we can use 420 for honeybee plantings if they're native, and we're just going to call them wildlife. So it's like I said, we've shifted. So I think now we're saying, yeah, they are wildlife. Although keep in mind, obviously not native wildlife, but so yeah, for 420 purposes, we're only going to use those native honeybee plantings. And obviously there is some argument, since they're an introduced species, they tend to nectar more on the introduced clovers. So, a lot of the, if you're working with a honeybee producer, they very well may want to go with those introduced species, either the clovers or they want to do the 645 with the mixed seasonal forages. So yeah, that's kind of been a tap dance, but I guess we're kind of evolving. And I'll show in a bit too. I have a seed calculator that I developed that was actually for honeybee, but covers all the monarch criteria. So we can really do it all as one. I believe this last slide I have on this 420. So so the standards, you'll see more and more that there's less specifics within standards, and it seems like the way we're rolling now is oftentimes more of those specifics are caught up in what we call guidance documents now. Previously, those were called tech notes. So if you're digging for something on the field office tech guide and you can't find it, it may have been renamed as a guidance document. So so we do have this 420 guidance document, habitat development for pollinators and butterflies. And I apologize because I went to the field office tech guide this morning. For some reason, it was removed. So I promised to get that back up. I'm not sure why it was removed. But right now, it's the exact same document that we have in 327 and 420. So I do want to point out, this is really the criteria that NRCS uses in developing a pollinator mix, and also our criteria for monarch butterfly. And there are a few changes that I think some of you will applaud, and so I'm going to cover those real quickly. So our first criteria is that a minimum of 9 species of pollinator-friendly native forbs. I think we can all agree 9 species is not a lot. That's not an extremely diverse mix, but that's kind of the minimum bar anyway. So we won't be developing a mix with any less than 9. So of those 9, at least 3 have to be from each bloom period, early, mid, and late. And those of you that have worked on the seed calculator, you'll know it gets really difficult to find those 3 early. We don't have a lot of early species. Lupin is one of the earliest species we have. However, that's a dry mesic species. Golden Alexander is really, one of the better early species. So we're a little limited on that. We have a lot of mid plants on the seed calculator, and we've got a lot of late too. So, but I guess my take home here is that the more diverse, the better. There is no maximum rate set for planting within 420. One thing that has changed also, I think previous it was at least 1 native bunch grass, and we're now changing that to have at least 2 native bunch grasses so that we don't end up getting, if we have a species that doesn't establish well, we want to make sure we at least get a couple there. Again, this is a minimum. No problem getting, 5 or more native bunch grasses out there. And so the one change too that we've had, it's always been a maximum rate of 10 seeds per square foot for grass. And there was a good justification for that because, many of our mixes, especially you look at some of the CRP mixes, they're so heavy on grasses, they just shade out the forbs and legumes. And so we end up with grass dominant stands. So there is a lot of justification for that. Kind of the thought I've put into this is, after looking at a lot of these mixes, is oftentimes we're not getting enough grass to actually get a good prescribed fire. So we're going to go to a minimum of 10 seeds, and then we're going to go to a maximum of 20 seeds. So that's going to allow a little more flexibility and hopefully give us a little more ability to burn some of these sites, as early as year 3. And then a couple other things: a minimum of 80% of the grass component shall be species other than Canada wild rye. Virginia rye or side oats grandma. Mike had mentioned earlier that, you know, Virginia wild rye and Canada wild rye, those are both cool season natives. And so I think it's really important to, like when we're looking at diversity, is to get some of those cool season natives in there. And yeah, Canada, the wild rye can actually serve as a really nice nurse crop, help control early erosion because it establishes quickly. I will say, and I'm sure many of you hear this from some of your landowners, that folks that have bird dogs and they hunt a lot, there can be issues with the awns getting embedded in you know, the hide of dogs, and then you have to take it to the vet, have it cut out, and so there are issues there. So we do get a lot of landowners that's, you know, do not want Canada wild rye or Virginia wild rye in the mix, and so I guess then you're left with side oats to get something that's similar. So that is a real concern. So we need to keep that in mind. No individual forb will comprise more than 20% of the mixture. I still think that's a rather high bar, but we're going to stick with that 20%. Again, the more diverse we can get these mixes, the better. At least one forb has to be a legume, so you got to get one out there. Considering the mixture benefit both pollinators and monarch butterfly, and so like I said, I'll show that in the mix. But you know, the costs are so low on most of the milkweeds that it just makes good sense to get that larval host plant into our mixes. And the other thing, common milkweed is also, it's a great plant for pollinators, for nectar also. So and it is, I mean, it's a plant that establishes fairly easy, and so so I strongly recommend just putting milkweed in everything. So, and then some of the specific planning criteria we have when looking at monarch butterfly is that milkweeds will comprise at least 1.5% of the total mixture based on seeds per square foot. So that we used to have a higher rate. I believe we were at 2%. So we're now down to 1.5%, which I think is a pretty good mix. So 2/3 of that milkweed must be common milkweed. So then you can add butterfly milkweed. A lot of landowners love the color of butterfly, makes them happy. So that's some of the other options. I think there's like 5 different milkweeds on the seed calculator. And then lastly, 60% of the forbs, seeds per square foot, must be monarch friendly forbs. And we'll cover that on the seed calculator also.
Steve,
So,
just a quick question about pesticide mitigation.
Sure.
Just somebody asked a little while ago, is it required for CRP plantings? Should we be considering mitigation? My thought is if it's adjacent to a crop field, you may want to.
So, yeah, everyone that is familiar with CRP knows that there is a difference between, at times, planning for NRCS and planning for FSA. And I will say that there is no requirement within CRP. However, where it does come into play is when we are doing the NEPA, which NRCS does do the NEPA for CRP, is that when you're filling out that form, the CPA 52, you are essentially addressing all environmental concerns. And so I would say maybe there's no requirement to do it from the CRP program side, but I would certainly put it in the NEPA form. So so no, there's, and then FSA needs to determine it from there. But like I said, as far as a planning step, I would certainly say if you're not addressing that with a producer, then that's poor planning, because we know that it's impossible to have a corn or soybean field adjacent to a planting and not have drift. It's just going to happen. And like I said, maybe we can't get, for CRP, we can't get that producer to a 20. Maybe we can't do all of that, but I think it's definitely something we need to make them aware of. Like I said, that tech note is very self-explanatory, so I would certainly provide that to them. But and there's really two schools of thought on the pesticide issue. I know my counterparts in Iowa NRCS, their thought is, well, all pollinator habitat is good pollinator habitat, and if it gets sprayed, it gets sprayed. And I guess Wisconsin, we're taking a different tact on that, just saying we need to plan for those impacts. And so I would, like I said, requirement for CRP, no. Requirement for NRCS, yes. I mean, like I said, it needs to be addressed in the CPA 52. And like I said, I think most producers, if they're going to the length of putting this habitat in, they're going to want to protect those pollinators. So I just wanted to throw up real quick this a snip from the guidance document that I mentioned previously for pollinators and monarch butterfly. And it's kind of a real quick cheat sheet to let you know this is by no means, all the species that are available. But what I tried to do is organize this, first of all, using the site characteristics. So kind of lumped dry mesic, wet mesic, and there is another category that I cut off here. So it's set by soil moisture regime, but then it lists all the species. So the first one is butterfly milkweed. And so it gives the color, gives the pollinator value, and is it good for honeybee? So in this case, yep, it's a honeybee species. And for monarch, is it a monarch species? Yep. It's listed as a larval host plant, also a nectaring plant. So you can just look right down the monarch column, and then you can see, because we need to meet that 60% monarch friendly. So you can see right away which ones are in there, are listed. And and then it provides the flowering season too. So the same information, like I said, a lot of this information is on the seeding sheet, but seed calculator. But I will say the seed calculator tends to call every forb and legume that's native good for pollinators, whereas this tries to break it down a little bit more in its relative value. For example, one of the most generic prairie forbs is yellow coneflower. Establishes everywhere. It's great. I would put it in every mix if you can meet the moisture regime, because we know it's going to establish. But all in all, it's a fairly poor pollinator plant. So anyway, this is just a resource. Usually when I talk to landowner associations, I'll hand this out to them. It's been really popular that they like this quick breakdown. And so just a resource for you to use. And just note for like honeybee, there are some like I said, they are an introduced species, but there are a few native species that they really love. So of course the clover. So the double X on this means under honeybee that is, like almost a superfood for honeybee. So purple prairie clover. Don't ask me why not white prairie clover, but it's not listed. And then, well, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. That is listed, white prairie clover and mint, mountain mint. A lot of the mints are exceptional for bees. And I know, for example, I mean, there couldn't be a more iconic plant than bergamot for bumblebees. Bumblebees are always on bergamot, so the mints are always exceptional. So just a little bit in the planning, I just wanted to point this out. I think a lot of people find this interesting when we look at what was really native prairie. So these maps are fairly similar, but when I pulled this information, on the left, the dry prairie locations in Wisconsin, that was, I believe this came from a DNR publication. And so all the yellow dots are where they have information going back, I mean, way back to like Lewis and Clark type information on where the existing dry prairies were. So that's kind of just an indication where they were. And then there's another document that I stole this map for on the right, the original regions of prairie and savanna. So you can see where historically we had the prairies. And so I guess my take home here is, seems like, you know, I'm getting more and more questions on oak savannas. People want to establish oak savannas, but I think you can use this map oftentimes just to make sure that you are actually in an oak savanna area, because you know, there's lots of part of the states that never had oak savannas. I find it interesting in that if you look in Southwest Wisconsin, and you know, you kind of look at that area of Richland, a little corner, Crawford, Vernon, and Sauk, you can see that, you know, that, well, that's cut out there. Well, obviously we know yet today that's a lot of woodland. So that's kind of what this is trying to show, is kind of the transition of what actually was prairie and savanna and what was woodland. So like I said, just kind of know your site. Talked a little bit before about soil moisture regime, and you know, both the seed calculator and what I showed previously in the guidance document kind of refer to that soil moisture regime, whether it's wet, mesic. And so where you can find that is on the field office technical guide, under section 2. You go to, if you look up in the left-hand corner there, it's under section 2, natural and cultural resources information, official soils data. And then if you look at the block up in the right, you'll see that when you click on that, you'll get soil moisture regime site assessment guide. And then when you click on that, you will get what you see at the bottom of the screen, and then you can select by your county. In this case, I just selected Grant County. And then if you look at the soil type, it pulls up, and you go way to the right, it will give you the soil moisture site condition. And so that's one way of coming up to see where your soils are at for soil moisture regime. And so a question I get a lot of times is, so how do I know if a landowner wants to add a species, or say they turned in their seed mix and it was not a species on our seed calculator, and you're contemplating, is that native or not? The best resource for that, 2 resources. One is a great publication that just came out about 3 years ago. It's called Wisconsin Flora. I think it's about $25, but it's a really nice publication. In lieu of purchasing that, I think almost all the information in that publication comes from this Wisconsin Flora. So www.wisconsinflora herbarium.wisc.ed. I think that needs to have a U on it. So that herbarium site is really good. So for example, I pulled up one of my favorite plants that's an annual prairie plant. We don't have a whole lot of them, but maybe one take home that I tell everyone is, like, when you're doing a prairie planting, you know, as long as it's dry mesic or mesic site, I definitely encourage you to put in partridge pea, for the simple reason it will germinate in as little as 8 days. I mean, this stuff is amazing how fast it germinates. Gets a beautiful yellow flower, and it will be the first thing to show up. And oftentimes you won't see other prairie plants for a long time. Nothing else. It gives the landowner some hope, because I think we all know that's the toughest thing about prairie plantings, you wait and wait and wait, and you get some very worried landowners. Well, at least it gives them a little hope. And it's an exceptional pollinator plant. And especially honeybees love it too. So, so this is a source that you can use to find out if it's a native species or not.
About 4 minutes left, Steve.
Yep. So here, I won't, Mike went through the seed calculator, so I'm not going to really cover any of that. Just one thing I do want to point out, and I'm sure a lot of you have had this frustration, is what I've circled in red. When you do your rate specification, you can either do pounds per acre or seeds per square foot. If you change this, say you put in a seeding mix and you got everything done and you're like, oh, you know what, I'm just going to click that and change it, it removes all of your seeding rates. It leaves the species, removes all the seeding rates. That's frustrating because then you got to start over again. So I would just encourage you to just click on the seeds per square foot for the native plantings, because that's really what we're targeted at, much more than pounds per acre. So just want to let you know that. Also, I tend to just check all under the soil moisture regime. The reason I do that is because, you know, not all sites are uniform. You might have some sites where you overlap, you know, a dry mesic and a mesic, or maybe there's pockets that fall into a wet mesic. And so by hitting all, it'll allow you to be very specific on the species you want that maybe cover multiple moisture regimes. Whereas if you just select wet mesic, it's not going to give you, you know, any of some of those additional species. So I just use all, but it is a nice tool. You know, if you do want to specify those exact species. So, but if you're a little more advanced and you select all, they'll give you more species. And so here's what it looks like fully populated. And this is just a honeybee mix I made for dry mesic. I will say I develop a lot of seed calculators for a lot of programs, CSP, honeybee, and we post those on the NRCS SharePoint. And I understand partners, you know, you don't have access to that, but certainly send me an email if if you're looking for some kind of a honeybee or monarch mix. I have a lot of canned seed calculators. So this just kind of shows you what you've got when you're putting this together and how it looks. It actually gives you a cost to, provides the percent of the mix, which is nice. And although it doesn't state at this point whether it's monarch friendly or not, when you go into the pull down, it will tell you in the pull down. And then this is what it provides on the last sheet. And then here you can see when you go down to the grand total, we have a grand total of 39.9 seeds per square foot. And if you go over all the way to the end and down below the 100%, it tells you you're monarch friendly for monarch mixes. So in this case, it was still 61% monarch friendly, even though it was a honeybee mix. So this is, like I said, calculator is a nice tool. Then you can just hit seeding plan for the customer and they can hand that to the nursery and get their mix. Don't have I'm run out of time, so just wanted to throw out just to remind folks that we do have these implementation requirements for almost all standards now, and it's just a good way to let the landowner know exactly what they need to do. So there's a lot of things in here, like what is your site prep? What are you going to use to establish it? Is it broadcasting? Is it a drill? Are you using tillage? And then the nice thing is you can get into some detail. If you want to get into detail on planting, you know, in this case for the site prep, it talks about using a broad spectrum contact herbicide. And then I talk about planting depth when using a no-till drill. And you can identify the companion crop and then the management they're going to do for weeds and then the long-term management. So, and then you have this timeline. Now we took this timeline out of 327, but it still exists in 420. So Some folks have asked us to remove it. They didn't think it was useful. Others like it. For now, we're going to leave it in 420. I think that's about what I'm going to end on the fact that I will get that 420 guidance document loaded to the Field Office Tech Guide by the end of the close of business on Monday. Just want to say our Pollinator Tech Note 8, which I did not talk about today, that is being revised, and I will have that posted to the Field Office Tech Guide by October 1. So that will have new information in that, and our companion pollinator guidance document will also be added to 327. So that's what I got.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Maybe we can stop recording, but we could still hang on the line if others have questions.
I stopped it.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So open mic, if someone wants to comment, take yourself off mute. We can listen.
I think, Mike, somebody must have put in a link for that, what I just got, online floral Wisconsin home. So thanks, Tanya, for posting that. Have I posted any filled out 420 IRs? Only on the SharePoint. So yeah, obviously those won't be accessible to folks, and I will. I guess yeah,
filled out version so people can see the example information to put in that.
Yeah, I have one because I tend to. I guess, yeah, we will talk, Mike and I guess, when we'll talk about where maybe we could post some of those. I will say right now, I tend to post them more for CRP because that's the first program that we've required the IRs for has been CRP. So I have posted like 612 IRs there. Obviously I wouldn't have posted a 620 because we don't use that CRP, but it's a good question. And probably the best solution is for us to find a location on the SharePoint. But to answer your question, I will put some of those, for the biology ones at least, I will put them on the biology SharePoint today. So thank you for that comment.
Steve, you can stop presenting. Otherwise, okay. I get to look at myself on your screen. That's scary. Okay, any other questions? So we're all still around if someone wants to comment. See, there's still 44 people on.
I don't see anything in the chat. I did see that there was a comment to some, Lisa had asked if we could make a print option on the seed calculator. And I will say that neither Mike nor I have responsibilities for the seed calculator. That's actually, we have an engineer that works on that. So there's been a lot of talk about doing a different format for the seed calculator. The problem is right now we have totally maxed out the functionality of Excel in the seed calculator. So my understanding is that we need to move to a different platform to get more functionality. And we're discussing that. But this print option might be one. We'll certainly forward that on to see if that's a potential.
That might be doable.
Like I said, there are some, glitches that sometimes that seed calculator is very slow, but right now the best we got, but we are in discussions on what's a better option.
Yeah, we even toyed with, I think, an Access database for information, but haven't proceeded with that.
Yeah, so the other thoughts that I think are great, we're going to move to also, that I believe planners will appreciate, is that the plant list will no longer be strictly tied to the calculator. The plant list will be a separate document, and then the calculator will pull from that. So what that will allow us the flexibility to do is that, maybe someone states, hey, it's a really good honeybee plant and it's native, but it's not on the calculator. Can you add that? Right now, I cannot. I don't, I'm not able to add that. It's quite the process to add it. But if we go to this new system, I'll just be able to, Mike or I just be able to add it to the NRCS plant list, and then it would automatically populate. The only problem with that is that's got to be, of course, then your version of the calculator has to be updated. But we are looking at that. Yeah, definitely we're looking at ways to improve this calculator. I don't know if you wanted to cover dormant seeds and hard seeds, Mike.
Yeah, I kind of responded to that.
Okay.
I had some quiz questions with that, but dormant and hard seed is really still seed, but we exclude it from the germination percentage calculation. So it pertains to legumes mostly.
One thing I will state on that I have heard before, and I'm not so sure if we remove this, or it's probably going to get removed from the 327, Mike, but I've heard it before where technically I think that Tech Note 5 states something like if you have a certain percentage of hard seed, you have to increase the total seeding rate. And I think we've talked that we're just going to get rid of that, right?
Yeah, I think the jury's out on things like hard and dormant seed, because there might be some freeze thaw action on that seed that's almost definitely going to make that seed germinate at some point. Any type of scarification on that seed coat will enable water to, imbibe, and boom. But it might take 3 months. It could take a year before some of that hard seed can be viable, but it's still there. Good discussions. Adam, you still around?
I am. I've actually seen a lot of red clover plantings that have had a lot of hard seed in them come 3 and 4, sometimes even 5 years later. It's stunning to see what a little bit of time will do with that.
I think red clover is one of them seeds that it can lay there for so long, right? I've seen fields that are just total pure grass, orchard brome, and then you go ahead and you do something to the surface, like cut it really low or do something to scratch it, and all of a sudden the red clover just comes up. It's amazing how that seed can lay technically kind of dormant in the soil for a long time until it gets that right depth, right temperature to germinate.
Yeah, I see that a lot.
Yeah, it's cool. We owe it to our ancestors, right? They probably planted 20 pounds to the acre when they first came from Europe.
Still appreciate that on a lot of sites.
Good old mammoth red, right? Pops in all the time. Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, I think no more questions, no more comments, right? We're going to close it out. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Todd. I think it was good. I think we can talk about seedings and plantings all week long, but good review anyway. So appreciate it, Steve. Actually, you've taught me quite a bit about 420 today. So with that, you guys have a good weekend. Hopefully some rain coming, right?
We're getting it right now in Appleton. It's been
Oh,
raining on and
nice.
off all morning, so.
Good, good, good. We need rain. My house is dry. So good luck, Steve. Take care.
Have a good day, everyone.
I'm signing out.
Talk to you later.